Welcome to Lore Citizen, a podcast dedicated to all things Star Citizen lore. If you enjoy this, make sure that you like, subscribe, and follow all of our social medias. Without further ado, let's get started. Hello and welcome to another, it's already going to say in the intro, but, Lore Citizen, another lore discussion podcast. We took a little break with Fist and Jale last time. Now we're back with Jale and Algrid, so I'll let them introduce themselves, and we'll kind of undergo the theme. Jale, who are you? What do you do in Star Citizen, and where can they find you?
I'm Jale. I am a little bit of a lapsed creator this month. I haven't really put anything out in a while, but I got some stuff that I'm going to be showing people soon. But yeah, I mostly do stuff about like xenolinguistics and maps and things that interest me like that.
Awesome.
And you can find my YouTube channel.
Yeah, and which is youtube.com/Jale, or is it?
Yeah, my account name is Jale, and hopefully it'll be linked in the description.
There will be a link in the description, yes, so that you can watch it there. Al, who are you? What do you do in Star Citizen? Where can they find you?
Old Man Al. Algara Beaumont is the character name. And I am I suppose a ship collector is probably the best way to describe me. And I am part of one of the info runners, and probably we're best known for our Fix My Fleet. We're people who are trying to get the best value of ships and the most gameplay loops are the things they want. Say, hey guys, can you help us? And then we spend several hours looking at their fleet and looking at what they want, and then looking at the options and helping them, I suppose, consolidate.
Awesome. To
get the best value. So,
yeah. Info runners, youtube.com/the info runners for those who are interested. And of course, all these links will be down below in the description. Last time we all three of us spoke, we talked about the first contacts of the various species. We talked about the Devarin, we talked about the Xi'an, and we talked about the Banu. The reason why we didn't talk about the Vanduul is because the Vanduul are an entire episode, like straight up an entire episode. Their whole conflict is a long, or their contact is conflict, and that conflict is a long, complicated history. So we didn't want to go over all of that. But we did want to talk a little bit about the aftermath of the First and Second Devarin Wars, specifically the Xi'an Cold War. And this is going to be a two-part series in and of itself because of how complicated it is, which is always confusing when I'm told that Star Citizen doesn't have any lore. It's like whenever I hear that there's nothing there. It's like, man,
history.
I can't even fill up, like, it's 13 hours at least for basics, not even the details and the interesting stuff that they've spent 8 years writing.
Yeah, I always find it amazing as well, the whole argument that we don't have a history, or there's no thing to get our teeth sunk into, and it's just depth upon depth upon depth and layer upon layer upon layer.
Yeah, and we were talking about this earlier about how it's written. It's important to understand that, like, most of the way that this is written isn't, textbook. This happened, this happened, this happened. This is canon. It's more as if it was written in universe. So a lot of this information is written with a bias implied or implicit in it. And
it's not that they don't have that canon and lore set somewhere down. All they're doing is they just keep sprinkling those breadcrumbs out for us, don't they? It really makes it, as a historian, I find that really interesting because it gives you stuff to dig around and search for and develop hypotheses and theories, and
it gives us stuff to talk about, which is interesting. So keep that in mind when we're talking about this stuff. Hopefully you're enjoying this so far. Please do continue to watch, subscribe, follow along on the audio podcast format. But as I said, we're going to be talking about the Xi'an Cold War, and talking about the human Xi'an Cold War, you have to start with the biggest part of the Xi'an Cold War, which was the Peri Line. So we'll start with Jale. Jale, why don't you give us a little bit of background on the Peri Line?
Thanks very much. So yeah, in that previous episode, we did cover the start of the Cold War in some detail. And I do recommend checking out that episode to understand how we're kick-starting all of this. but it's kind of intertwined with the formation of the Perry Line. I'm just going to give you the briefest outline of what we were discussing there, and then how this then fits in. So we met the Xi'an in 2530 when a terraforming company bumbled into a Xi'an system. Whole team was captured, took 2 weeks to negotiate their release, and the cost of that release was giving up detailed information about the human expanse, which was the UPE at the time. There was tensions rising because in 2541, that's 11 years later, we discovered the Tavaran, started the first Tavaran War, and then so you got this paranoia of the time. Ivan Messer comes along. He's a war hero. He has some of his mates bomb various cities across the UEE, blame it on the Xi'an. He becomes imperator in 2546. So that's where we end up, where we're deep in a Cold War. But in the middle of that, we glossed over 2542, the formation of the Perry Line, and we're going to explore that in some detail. And to understand the motivations for its formation, we need to discuss a few discoveries that actually came just after that first contact in this period when the Cold War is starting. I'm also going to be saying a lot of dates and a lot of system names, and I might make some graphic that will help. If not, I've made this star map where you can actually like slide through and see when these systems get discovered and get that in a bit of more context.
They'll probably be up on the
screen
right now.
So, following the first contact negotiations in 2530, the UPE had agreed to retreat from the undeveloped system that the Xi'an called the Sung, and humanity would come to call Pallas. Forces gathered in the Baker system to keep a watchful eye on the jump point. And then a year later, another jump point was discovered in the same system, this time to a system that the Xi'an called Yamon. The nav jumper responsible, Tisa Morrison, soon ran into a Xi'an military mining escort and tried to avoid revealing the location back to human space. She was a good scout. She reported the discovery immediately, and soon after, the military just surrounded this jump point. But also, fortunately, so did press and other members of the public, waiting to see if the Xi'an actually saw her come back. And a couple of weeks later, a Xi'an scout pops out. And very fortunately, there was lots of press there because there were a lot of itchy trigger fingers right then. And the Xi'an scout sort of popped out, saw the human fleet, went back. No shots were fired. But fortunately, we narrowly dodged a hot war starting there and then. So there's not much information about what happened over the next decade, but it seemed likely that there would have been some pretty significant military presence in Baker, because that's where both of these systems connected into. And that's our only portal that we knew of to the South Xi'an at the time. The system to this day has no habitable worlds, and that's maybe why we don't know so much about this period, because there probably weren't that many civilians around, and it was sort of a remote outpost with the Navy guarding this back door. But what we do know is that bold corporations began exploring Yamon, as it turned out it was a relatively new discovery for the Xi'an as well, and the Navy had no real basis to actually stop people from going past. And the next chapter of human-Xi'an relations would then center on systems a few jumps away, off Castor and Kiel, that kind of area of space. The complications that the Xi'an presented to future exploration had led the UPE to found the Government Cartography Agency in the hope that military nav jumpers trained in diplomatic protocols would be able to avoid the disastrous events of Xi'an First Contact. It was against this backdrop that in 2539, one Dehunsil Kosoko stepped out of hospital on Prime, having recovered from the loss of a leg in a ship crash, bought a brand new ship, and then got straight back to work as an explorer. And 3 weeks later, he struck the gold he'd been looking for his entire career and found a new jump point in what was then called the Nivellen system, now known as Hadrian. He found a scientific wonder, a proto-system rife with research possibilities. He reported his findings to the UPE, and the newly formed GCA got to work surveying the new discovery, at the time called the Adara system, after his grandmother. That's Dehunsil's grandmother. A couple of jumps away, another new system was slowly going through the initial stages of colonial exploration. Horus had been registered with the UPE in 2528, 2 years before Xi'an First Contact. I say registered because the discoverer, Mary Sante, had spent many years charting the system in secret before reporting her findings. Indeed, legends say that she may have found it at the age of 14 while running away from home in a stolen ship. After the discovery was reported to the wider UPE, Sante continued to explore the system she had spent so much of her life in, as other hardy prospectors moved in to seek their fortunes. So this brings us up to 2542, two major discoveries. The precise order of events isn't 100% clear, but it appears that first, Mary Sante, pushing ever further out in her beloved Horus system, discovered a new jump point into Xi'an space. And while the previous discoveries had been into uninhabited systems with tenuous Xi'an claims with Thusung and Yamon, this was into Rilar, a major Xi'an system with at least one developed planet at the time. Now it's two because it became a major military hub. Immediately, the UPE took control of the Horus system, displacing the sparse inhabitants who moved there. Only Sante remained, refusing the order to retreat. And bear in mind, 2542, this is 1 year after the start of the First Tavaran War. Suddenly, in the space of 2 years, we found not only another hostile race that we're now at war with, but discovered a new route for the Xi'an to invade, or at best, a new jump point right into the key system that they might perceive as a threat and attack us over that. So something had to be done. And so, the Peri Line was born. Older lore credits the creation to a high naval commander Gianna Peri, but the more up-to-date Galactopedia states that it was a Navy General Armistead Peri who was responsible for its creation. It was proposed to the tribunal that all who ruled the UPE that all Xi'an-connected systems be placed under Navy control, and after much deliberation, the UPE leaders agreed that the uninhabited systems along the human-Xi'an border would become militarized no-man's lands. Horus, which had been named for Mary Sante's ship, established the pattern for naming such systems, as Horus had been the Egyptian god of war. So following that precedent, Thusung became Pallas, one of the names of the Greek goddess Athena, and the Yamon system became Hadur, from Hungarian mythology. Later, that same year, in 2542, in the Odara proto-system that Kosoka discovered, we spoke about earlier, a Xi'an scout was discovered by GCA surveyors and immediately became the fourth Peri-Line system, renamed Gerzil after a Berber deity. It too linked into Rilar. So naturally, the corporations who had invested in those systems were upset and began to sue the UPE, but those were sort of put to stop to later when 4 years later, Ivor Messer overthrew the UPE tribunal, established the UEE, and you can't sue the Imperator, unfortunately. So 4 more systems would eventually join the Peri Line for a total of 8. There's one where we don't know the exact dates on, which is the system now known as Kukya, which was Indra to the UEE from Hindu mythology. And that's also one of the 2 Peri Line systems which don't actually connect into UEE space. So the Oya system was named for the Yoruban Orisha of wind, storms, death, and rebirth, and that was discovered by a Navy Lieutenant Eli Price in 2587. He was pursuing some outlaws through a previously unknown jump point in Castra, and that came through into the Xi'an Nature Reserve system of Ialus, which would that would subsequently draw that new system into the Peri Line. The 7th system bore the odd notable feature of being the only Peri Line system with no connection to Xi'an space at all. Adia Firmino and Oisha Swen, 2 small-time smugglers out of Levski, had discovered an unremarkable system linked to the unclaimed Nyx system, where Levski is. Notable only for the very public dispute they had over the discovery rights. So the advocacy were issuing warrants for these 2 people while they're duking out in the press over who discovered this. But the UE didn't find this system that interesting. It was just a backwater off a backwater that they weren't claiming. But then later that, like a couple of years later, a jump from this newly discovered system to the Peri Line system of Oya was discovered. So they then took this empty system, which was named Tohil, after a Mayan deity, and it became sort of a support system that was adjacent to the Peri Line at that point in time. And then the final system, Virtus, was named from Roman mythology. That was discovered through a jump point from Tohil. That system was already known to the Xi'an as Lawo, and this discovery actually made the UE readdress their deployment, and they pulled it back to Castra and Oya because they feared becoming overextended in systems that had connections to non-UEE space, like with Nyx. So Virtus was actually a Peri Line system in essentially name only. It was believed that because it had a big red giant in the middle, it would not really be a viable route for invasion, and any such fleet would have to come through Tohil anyway, and they were at least monitoring enough to see fleets. But the relatively lax security in these 2 systems would prove important during the Cold War, as you'll see. And so the Perry Line was built system by system, brick by brick, a bulwark against invasion, but also a barrier against mutual understanding. And a classic Perry Line system would feature the two navies facing off over this expanse with minefields, listening points, and military maneuvers designed to demonstrate your strength but not provoke an actual response. And it was over or under this wall that the Cold War would be fought, with sniping and subterfuge.
There we go. I was just wondering because like some of this information literally just came out that you're talking about, and I'm looking over it like right now because I was like, oh yeah, a lot of this stuff is stuff that was there kind of before, but I actually did a video on Towhill, and it's interesting how Towhill exists because like no one cares about Towhill, and it's one of those systems that because no one cares about it, it becomes one of the most important systems in modern UEE history. And the cool part about it is that because of that whole system, because it was so connected to the Nix system, they didn't want to monitor it because they'd have to go through Nix, and they already didn't have any presence in Nix. So while they had some weak monitoring equipment, it wasn't good enough. So smugglers were just rife through Towhill. It was literally a smuggler's paradise. And it was like later in the Empire that like wealthy, well-to-do like Meserites would buy up like buildings on Towhill in I think Towhill 3 on these floating flower beds, and would literally be rubbing elbows with like smugglers because it was like just this beautiful sunset. And so it's like this senator is eating dinner with like one of the worst pirate captains in the entirety of the UEE just because they happen to both be on Towhill kind of thing. It's this weird kind of melting pot location. So.
And when you consider like Towhill's position to Nix, and Nix has got jump points galore,
yeah,
it really does become that route where if you're trying to smuggle things in, you go to Towhill, Nix, and then everywhere.
Yeah.
And so it really is that kind of area where no one cares about it, and yet it is so important to so many aspects of Star Citizen lore. The piracy, the Cold War, you name it. It's there, isn't it?
It's a huge diplomatic location too, which we'll talk about not this episode, but in the next episode, in dealing with the end of the Cold War. So, but yeah, with that said, let's move on to the next part, the actual fighting over the quote unquote fighting, the Cold War fighting that went on in this time period with Al. Go take it away, Al.
And so this paper is entitled War by Other Means. And as it goes on, I think you'll see the different approaches to the Cold War, or the way conflict was envisaged. And to say the relations between humanity and the Xi'an Empire have been cold, if not frozen, during the first 3 centuries following first contact, would be an understatement. And that is clearly seen in various skirmishes along the Perry Line. In this study, we're going to examine 3 such encounters, which are often referenced by undergraduate students of Huxa relations. But I feel most students fail to fully understand the conflict because they focus on 2 of the main instances, which do not really fit the Xi'an preference for subtlety and manipulation. And I think that is really a key aspect when we're thinking about the way in which the Xi'an approached the Cold War and the way humanity and the Meses approached the Cold War. The first reference study is often cited as the standoff at Hador. In the year 2550, shortly after the First Tavaran War, Ivan Meza was keen to establish a strong perimeter and had ordered the deployment of an experimental long-range scanner, the TKL 2900, within the Perry system at Hador, near the Baker jump point. However, the ship suddenly exploded, and the first responding UEE naval vessel to the scene found several Xi'an ships already scanning the debris. And it was only after that ship had fired warning shots across the bows of the Xi'an ships that they withdrew. They tried flying by, they tried sending warning messages and other things, and the Xi'an just ignored them. And it was only when they fired those shots that they went, oh, yeah, they're serious, we better go. And this led to the build-up of both sides, starting to send ships to monitor the situation. And of note, with the standoff it had over 3 points. First, the Xi'an were not persuaded from their scanning of a wreck until those shots were fired across their bow. Second, the Xi'an build-up was the cause for concern, as Admiral Hershey, I'm going to call him Admiral Hershey Bar because he sounds like a chocolate bar, had ordered every ship in his fleet to the Baker system, still in Baker, to join him, because he knew his fleet would soon be outnumbered by the Xi'an. As a result, he also ordered the Nautilus to lay a minefield. Now, at this point, the Nautilus was still secret. It still hadn't been put out. And he was hoping that it would be able to lay its minefield and get out of there, get some more mines and come back and do all of that before the Xi'an arrived. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The Xi'an did arrive, and all accounts, all eyewitness reports from the time state that a massive Xi'an fleet arrived. If we were going to a shooting war, this was one of those situations that said, we are going to get our butts handed to us on a silver platter. The third is once Admiral Hershey's fleet had recovered the flight recorders and withdrew to the Baker system, the Xi'an did their own scans of the wreckage and also left the area. And they made no effort to stop the UE from withdrawing. And that's key because it really shows the Xi'an way of fighting war. If they need to, they will go to a shooting war, but they'll prefer to use other means. So, true to their nature and preference to subtlety manipulation, we see them avoid that shooting war. And it's significant because in that situation, they clearly had a superior force in numbers, and they also aimed not to be outright aggressors. And when you look at the physiology and the society of Xi'an culture, that's one of the things you do see stands out. In none of their conflicts, they've been the recognised attacker or aggressor. They've always seemed to be the responding to, at least with physical force. I think they might move forward using politics and other means first, but certainly not physical force. The second incident that students often cite is this happened in 2617 in their Kaffa system near the newly discovered Horus Kaffa jump point. This encounter is significant for two reasons. First, it involved the discovery of a new jump point. Second, it demonstrated the Xi'an resolve and threat to the UAE. When Lieutenants Ahmed Hora and Carl Dyson discovered the Horus Jaffa jump point, they made the joint jump point, little knowing it was into a full-blown Xi'an system. They were neutralized by an EMP and captured, and after being interrogated for 3 days and having their ships stripped and examined, they were escorted back to the jump point with a warning. And that warning was any further UAE vessels would be attacked on sight. So while the Xi'an may have preferred that subtlety and manipulation, they were also quite willing, if need be, to say, draw a line in the sand and say, thus far, no further. The third incident, which has really only recently been declassified, has only been referenced by a few, most notably by Terrell Parker. And while the dates of this incident are still currently redacted, I feel it demonstrates more than the Kaffa kerfuffle, as I've called it, or the standoff at Hador, the preferred way of waging war that the Xi'an have. While the date is redacted, I believe the incident occurs near the end of the Mezan regime, mainly because Terrell Parker refers to the incident as the death knell for Aegis as a shipbuilding industry. But it's only after the fall of the Meza that Aegis fortunes decline as military contracts for that company dry up due to its strong links with the Mezas. And that forced the company to reinvent itself in terms of its marketing. This so-called death knell for Aegis occurs because they were seeking to actually serve and actually help humanity by developing a ship that would enable naval personnel who had been stationed on the Perry Line their whole career to actually be stationed elsewhere. They developed an AI-piloted Overlord bomber. The evidence indicates that the bomber had succeeded in all its trials, so much so that the Navy deployed a prototype bomber wing along the Perry Line at Horace, and the ships went rogue. Now, it's interesting because what happens is the AI determined their comm systems had been compromised to ensure that there was no incident resulting in a hot war. The UAE hunted down and destroyed the ships of that bomber wing. But here's where I start to wonder. Did the AI go wrong, or were their systems actually compromised? And the idea that their communication systems were compromised by Xi'an hacking or Xi'an listening is conceivable when you consider the way they prefer to fight war, and also the simple fact that until they were on the Perry Line, those ships had been working perfectly. And so it seems to work with both ideas, and it seems very convenient that the AI went rogue at that particular time. Furthermore, analysts of the fall of the Mezzes do agree that the fall of the Mezzes were orchestrated by the Xi'an manipulation. And I think this knowledge reinforces a hypothesis previously discussed here that the Xi'an funded and possibly encouraged the Tavaran, which led to the second phase of the Tavaran War. Now, I'm sure my colleagues may agree or disagree with me on this point. But we can certainly reference the harbouring of political opponents to the Mezzes until such a time as they could return and lead revolt. And that seems to apply to any of the conflicts. But why the Xi'an prefer to fight war is by other means. They prefer, rather than shooting, to encourage xenophiles or others. And this gives the rise of xenophiles in our Senate, and also the rise of Leilani Addison, whose own love affair with all things Xi'an. And I suspect that she was knowingly or unknowingly bankrolled by the Xi'an Imperial Court. We should know how much, or we should ask how much we are moving towards being a Xi'an client state, or whether we are just being more friendly. The Xi'an appear to glitter and shine as paradons of virtue and peaceful intent. But for me, the old adage that all that is gold does not glitter also seems true of our Xi'an neighbours. So there you go, gentlemen.
I disagree.
I thought you would.
I would.
Yeah.
I get the concept, but it strikes me as a little bit too Xeno threat. You know what I mean? A little too on the tinfoil hat kind of conspiracy. It's important to note with the Xi'an that the Xi'an are a people who are quite literally distrustful of themselves, let alone everybody else. They have a history of constant warfare that nearly wiped them out as a species. And it seems like one of the few species that they met that could best them or equal them nearly killed them, and they scares the ever living hell out of them with the Krthak. So
it reminds me of the. I know you just said you up, but the way in which I imagine they see humans is a bit like the way the Vulcans see humans in Star Trek.
Star Trek.
That we remind them too much of themselves, and it scares the crap out of them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you also got to remember that, like, it seems like, at least according to the current lore, that the contact with humans is directly a result of the Krthak Wars, of the Spirit Wars, because after the Spirit Wars essentially turn with House Kree coming to power, they ban all expansion towards Krthak space and start moving the opposite direction, which heads them right into human space. So if you're a species that are already kind of distrustful of everything, and you run smack dab into another species, which is maybe slightly technologically behind you, but is rapidly catching up to you, you might be a little bit more willing to employ clandestine measures. I feel like it was less of the Xi'an puppeteering and more of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And if we help these people out, then we won't have a dangerous rogue state on our borders.
So instead of
yeah,
the friend of my enemy is my enemy, the friend of my friend, my friend.
Yeah, whatever. The friend of my enemy is my friend. I think I don't remember what I said, but yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we as humans, we don't like being made to do a good thing. As in, even if it's a good idea, if someone's telling us to do it, we don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And there is great textual stuff to say that the Xi'an helped overthrow the Messers because it benefited them, but it also benefited humanity because the Messers were bad. And I think that there's a sense that if we can find Xi'an fingerprints on something, then therefore it's now a bad thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is. And I think that also there's something that in your talk and also in my talk that shows just how dedicated they were to not going to war with us. The Kefir incident, that system contains Raipuang, which is literally their Vatican City. And suddenly the UE military just stumbles in and is like, oh, crap. And they give us a quick pat down, 3 days, that's nothing to them. And so goes anyway, so don't come back. And with the establishment of the Perry line, there's 3 systems that they found first, and we rock up and say, right, this is part of the Perry line now, you better back off. Out of systems they found first. And they just go, okay, easy, backing up. And they kind of acquiesce to avoid war every step.
And you see that with the Horus, the standoff at Horus as well. Their fleet that turns up, everything seems to say massive fleet, not just big fleet, not just a fleet that will equal us, but a fleet that the Admiral calls every ship in his fleet from Baker to Horus because he knows I'm going to be outnumbered soon.
Mm-hmm.
And when the fleet arrives, it's a massive Xi'an fleet. It's not a fleet that isn't going to cause us grief. It's like a fleet that's going to wipe the floor with Admiral Hershey-Bar. And
it reminds me of. I'll just quickly. It reminds me of how there is the few humans who have been able to test Xi'an spacecraft. I remember exactly the planet where this is, but it ends up being the place where they were sent to test was a military planet. It was one of the Xi'an's military training facilities, and the Xi'an invited humans over there because they wanted to test pilot humans being able to fly Xi'an ships for the eventually Huxah for those sorts of things. And of course the pilots were heavily influenced by the military intelligence who were trained ahead of time. They were trained ahead of time to be like, you toss everything you see. And the Xi'an kind of knew this, so they just kind of had a massive fleet there the entire time those humans were there, so that it was nothing but a fleet. That seems more along the lines of the Xi'an style of we don't want to ever show you our full hand because we don't trust you. It's kind of like they live next door to an angry gorilla with a shotgun who's known to just swing it around and start shooting at things that aren't them. So yeah, if an angry gorilla with a shotgun busts down your front door, you may back up a few steps and just be like, all right, cool, I'm going to go into this door, rather than you may be more intelligent and can kill an angry gorilla with a shotgun, but do you want to fight an angry gorilla with a shotgun? So,
but it also does more than that, because it shows the UEE and those pilots go back and say, oh yeah, the massive bloody fleet guarding that, guarding that planet. We got to fly some of their ships, but they've got lots of ships there. They outnumber us. They've got big ships. And so it's saying, hey, you go to war with us. You start a shooting war with us, and we're going to
one last thing that I think there isn't any textual support for is Xi'an involvement in the Second Tavaran War, though. I don't think there's anything really to say that they knew about the holdout Tavaran. We're talking about the exact opposite side of the empire to them, and we also get the sense with the discoveries we make that those are new systems to them as well, where our fringes are coming up. So I don't buy the involvement in Korathal. I mean, obviously they would probably be making hay while the sun's shining otherwise with the UE and distracted. But I
There
don't
is
buy
there
that
is a
one.
reference that the after the First Tavaran War, Tavaran refugees went into Xi'an and Banu space.
Hmm.
Um,
But it doesn't
and
appear that Korathal appeared from Banu space
we
because
don't know
he appeared in one of the
anything about
UE.
him. And
Yeah.
and I know we've talked previously that the other Tavaran systems of their empire just became a remainder of their empire, and that seems to be likely where Korathal came from, and likely they had secret military bases or had been building up their military quietly and slowly in the background.
Yeah.
But if you've got the Cold War building up, I could see, and if we know from the way in which the Xi'an use the Underground Railway to bring dissidents in and out of the Empire or out of the UEE, I can also see them using that same method in that early period of the Cold War, as when things were probably at their hottest, to actually assist. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend,
Well,
and
that wouldn't have
assist them in that
existed.
way.
That wouldn't have existed at that point because we hadn't discovered those systems that at that point. And yeah, I think that we'll learn a lot more about the Tavaran when we get like they're the least fleshed out really out of
Yeah.
out of all the races. Even if the Vandal, we don't know their fleshed out bits. Tavaran are the ones that we're going to hear about, I think, a lot over the next couple of years, and it should hopefully add some clarity to these questions.
And certainly, I think the Tavaran are one of those races we do want to learn more about, because they're the one race that is fully integrated within the UEE, and so if anything, that's the one race we would know, or as citizens of the UEE, we should know more about. And yet we know more about the Xi'an and the Banu than we know about the citizens of our empire.
I think that has more to do with just the development, because they just aren't as important in storylines. So, yeah, I'm trying to find this last one. I'm trying to blank on it, so I'll probably just kind of skip it for now. But there's something that in one of the jump points, I was like, aha, I remember this, and then I just blanked my mind. I forgot what it was now. But for my section, but we'll move on to the last section. We talked about the Perry line. We talked about the military conflicts around the Perry line. I'm going to discuss some of the war at home situation. The first mention of not so good relations between the Mezers and their own people starts around the death of Mezer the First. The first celebrations that were widespread of Day of the Vara comes from the year after Ivor Mezer the First died. And it was ostensibly a way of poking fun at and politically protesting the Mezer regime. It seems that since the First Tavaran War and before the Second Tavaran War, there were already large numbers, obviously people who didn't like the idea of the UEE. And the hotbed of this activity centered around Terra. And this has a lot to do with Terra's proximity to the Xi'an Empire. Terra being a up-and-coming system, expanding and exploding in trade, and having such massive numbers of jump points in its own system, allowing for easy travel to just about anywhere in the Eastern Empire, was already starting to show its disdain for having to deal with Earth. And it seems that early on, Terran radicals, especially Terran artists and intellectuals and politicians, seem to blame the Mezers for the war pretty early on. They seem to think that the Mezers were the reason why a lot of these conflicts that didn't need to happen. They were seeing an opportunity for trade and profit that was being restricted by the Mezers' xenophobia. And as I said, October 27th, 2953, the members of Terra's counterculture picked up this superstition of the Day of the Vara, which was essentially you would dress as the dead crew members of the Vara to ward off evil spirits. So, but instead of dressing as dead members of the ship the Vara, which disappeared in the the Hades system, they dressed up, all of the counterculture members dressed up as Emperor Ivar Mezer I, who had died a year before, as a way of warding off evil. So this is just kind of shows you that fairly early on, almost the year after Ivar Mezer's death, there are open disdain for the Mezers and for this Cold War. But this would build up over and over and over again, and a split began to form between the Western and Eastern empires. The Western empires much more loyal to the imperators, where the Eastern empires was being more and more drawn towards towards Terra, being the kind of center of culture and counterculture against the UEE. Now, this would come to a at least early head in 2638, specifically March the 12th, 2638, when a particular leader of the Terran government, the Terran governor Xi'an Kiernan, unveiled a proposal, a vote for Terra to leave the UEE. This is the first attempt by any system that we know of to leave the UEE through diplomatic means. And it was a media frenzy. Specifically in this discussion, it was mentioned that the Xi'an and the Banu are our neighbors, where we see them every day. We know that they're not our enemy. They're people just like us. Their culture may be different, their motivations may be different, but they're just trying to live and live safely. The Imperator is happy to keep them at a distance, though, through the sights of weapons. But I don't believe we can continue on this path. If you live anticipating a war, sooner or later, you will have one. That's his words. This sparks off a media frenzy of Terra trying to leave the UEE. The Imperator at the time, who was Livia Mezer, the second Mezer, or the Livia Mezer III, who is the daughter of the second Mezer, was very quiet. But suddenly, this motion for separation failed. It failed spectacularly after media blitzes of how bad it was. And around the same time, or should I say after this had happened, the governor suddenly was found to have been had a raging drug addiction and corruption and every single thing that you can imagine were thrown at the governor. While the governor Kiernan himself was saying that the Mezers had tampered the election, that they had been doing all sorts of nasty things, which we know now the advocacy was very much part of at the time. And suddenly, about 2 years later, in 2638, he disappears. Xi'an Kiernan disappears entirely. Nowhere to be seen. And of course, heavily is suspected that the Imperator was involved. Livia and her future, the other Mezers after Livia began campaigns of black bagging and dragging civilians into shadow prisons, specifically on Charon III, where a major prison was built to house political prisoners. So it became a back and forth pretty quickly in the UEE, specifically around Terra, where many very visible members of UEE society could speak out, but only so much. This all changed dramatically after the discovery of the Tohill system. As we've kind of illustrated, how Tohill eventually found itself as part of the Peri line. with connections to the Xi'an, even though it had never really been taken seriously. In Tohil, shortly discovery that it was connected to the Xi'an Empire, Xi'an and UEE, or Xi'an and human smugglers, began to meet and exchange goods around Tohil. This meeting and exchanging of goods continued to also pass messages back and forth. And soon, as many members of the growing resistance against the Mezers would find out they needed to escape, soon people began to be smuggled from the UEE to Xi'an space, where the Xi'an would offer protection against the Mezers blackbagging, disappearing into political prisoners, or just assassinations. And this process was funnily started in Bremen. Today, Bremen is known for Big Bennies and for guns. But back towards the end of its heyday after the Second Tevarin War in 2792, Bremen became the centerpiece of actual resistance. If Terra was the figurehead, then Bremen was the teeth. Bremen, as it was slipping into more obscurity, as its profits were dwindling from many of its crops, many members of Bremen society, including members of government, and the vaunted Bremen Defense Force, the best militia in the UEE, secretly were siding with anti-Mezer radicals, helping to smuggle high members of society out of the UEE for their protection, including one Auguste Dunlot, the future founder of Crusader Industries. This movement of people was not just a movement of people. It was a movement of people, of ideas, of goods. And soon, this Bremen, I don't remember exactly what it's called, the Bremen Beltway, which would take people from Bremen to Nix to Tohil to Wirtus. I can't pronounce the the Xi'an names. Lau. I'm messing that right up. I'm waiting for Jale to correct me.
Lawo.
And ending up in, I'm just going to say the UEE version of it, Elias, was a pathway to freedom. It was a established pathway which would eventually lead to the overthrow of the Mezers. But it's quite clear from very early on in the Xi'an Cold War that the home front was lost almost instantly.
Yeah, the new article that got published today really put a bit of a fox amongst the pigeons with us.
Yeah,
great. We got to rewrite everything.
Go through all this. Yes.
I think the Bremen Beltway story is absolutely fantastic. Like, bit of addition to all of this. I think a lot of those people would have probably ended up in this. There's this city called Kurilla on the planet Xi, which is in the Rillar system, and that appears to be where, like, it's like the London of the a lot of the people who had to leave Russia because of persecution and then came back and did the communist revolution. They were in London, and Kurilla was very much like the London of the Messers, in that it was where all their dissidents had ended up, and it sounds like a really cool place.
I wonder if in the library in that city there'll be an encyclopedia or a book that's got the scribblings of Aldous Dunlop, kind of.
Yeah.
Monsieur Auguste Dunlop.
It's the Casablanca of its time, you should say, like the where
yes. Yeah,
good
there's a note. There's a note about it where the Xi'an don't care about human-on-human crimes in theirs to this day. So you still get some like bounty hunters going and snatching people up who are trying to use it to hide.
Nice, yeah.
But of note in the information is also, as is the Cold War whereas the Mezzers are losing power, and after the incidents with Anthony Tanaka really kick off, but they reverse that beltway, don't they? That rather than people going into Xi'an space, it's all the dissidents are now being ferried back.
Yes,
and then going from Tohul to Nyx, and then from Nyx to everywhere.
Yeah. Well, it's not just Nyx.
So,
Bremen. They're going back to Bremen because Bremen, like, it's almost like it's even recently said. It's like it's only really recently released, like in the last 2 decades, that really explained how deep Bremen was in the resistance. They were key. Like, we have records from government officials. Like, a lot of the revolution was headquartered from Bremen. We talk about how the Tide, this terrorist organization, this freedom fighting organization that existed, was able to piggyback on military pathways, military communications to be able to keep the lines open. And it's not specifically said, but I wouldn't be surprised if the headquarters of the Tide was Bremen. It's that because like I said, they mentioned there are government officials which may just mention maybe Bremen government, but it could be even the UEE government, because we know that senators were involved in the revolution, especially when which I didn't mention, the Acre Treaty was signed there. I didn't know where we were going to talk about. I figured that would be a good kind of next episode to talk about the Cray, the detente, as it were, towards the end. But like, we know that those people were involved in that, so we know that like Bremen is one of those systems that I'm really interested in, because it is very, very much the crossroads of humanity in terms of like whatever's going on in human space. Bremen is involved in it, and just about every single conflict or every single event, Bremen plays a key role in it. From the First Tavarn War being the breadbasket of the QEE, to the fall of the Mezzers, to even today.
And you'll find that. Go on, Joe.
I was going to say, I think an interesting thing about Bremen is that it maintains a really significant militia in the Bremen Defense Force, and that large parts of them were involved in allowing this Bremen Beltway to go away, while kind of keeping the elements who weren't in favor of it away from these smugglers. And I think that's interesting that there's this sort of implicit thing that if it had ever become a civil war, the BDF would probably have been like a core of like an armed rebellion. I think that's implicit in that.
They probably were too. We just don't know a lot about the revolution. Like, they may have been the core of the Tide's military forces that would eventually lead it. So.
To pick up a point you made about my very, very Xeno threat theme, which I wasn't actually trying to do a Xeno threat theme, but it does kind of have that threat of certainly foreign influence. Is how much of the Xeno threat force are actually Mezzerites?
That's good.
Now, I personally think significant numbers of them are the Mezzerite force, the Navy that really didn't want the fall to happen, have kind of gone off and done their own thing, and almost, if it's in a sense, being like a Devaran, find a little place of them, build up their own forces and get other like-minded individuals, and then they're now trying to influence by force the way. And I think they're going to fail because, well,
they're just not in a good
they're
position.
crazies.
The thing that is interesting is like a lot of your pitch about that Xenothreat stuff. It actually sounds a lot like centralist discussions, like how the centralists speak, and you look at the politics of the lore posts, because that's very much a cornerstone. Yeah, it's very much a cornerstone of the centralist party, and you can see it through a lot of the Congress Now posts, where it's like, do not trust the alien. Not necessarily the alien is bad, but distrust the alien, because the alien always has an ulterior motive. Be them Tavaran, be they Xi'an, be they Banu. Do not trust aliens. Trust humans, because we understand who humans are. We don't know who aliens are, and because we don't know them well enough, we shouldn't let them in. This kind of underlining xenophobia, which, in the extreme ends you have Xenothreat, and at the more moderate ends you have, the current senators from the Vega system. So,
And then
Well, yeah, well, one of the Vega system was in favor of it, the one
Yeah.
from Aramis, and then one with sorry, what we're referring to here is the nomination of a Xi'an person as the ambassador to the Xi'an from the UEE, and it was actually seconded by the senator from Aramis in the Vega system, and then opposed by the senator from Celine,
yeah,
who are both centralists as well.
yes, which would surprise me, but yeah.
But I think that it makes sense. Like, if you're looking at an ambassador to, you know, do you take someone who is a national of that nation, who's got links to that nation, who's got family living in that nation, to be your representative representing your interests? I think, yeah, you want that Tavaran on that as your part of your ambassador team, but you also need humans on that team.
Yeah, I mean,
because you need people who actually understand
yeah,
where humans are coming from. You need someone who understands where the Tavaran are coming from on your team, but you also need someone who represents you and where people are coming from. And
he'd previously been an advisor to the past ambassador, and that's a great role for him. I'm also of this opinion that he wasn't a great candidate, and I think actually speaks to what you were talking about Leilani Addison's connections to the Xi'an, in that this is a wealthy businessman from her home city where she ran the campaign out of that city.
Who also graduated from the same college.
It's like, yeah, I think that's a reference to American practices of you give your mates the cushy ambassadorships, and then so that's something that most countries don't do.
I think it's often said I think in Australia that the same idea. You know, you give someone a cushy ambassadorship either to get rid of them or because as a reward, depending on where you send them.
In America, you just buy them. You just give enough money to the campaign, and you get to be ambassador to France and live in Paris for a bit. So.
Which is sad because we actually do have people who spend their whole lives working in the service, in the foreign service, too, like as ambassador assistants and stuff like that. It's a completely different discussion, though. I think that might actually be a good discussion, kind of an end point. That whole post would be a good end point for the thawing and the current state of the Xi'an human relations. You know,
to be continued.
To be continued.
No, I know, and I've been playing devil's advocate a little bit with the very Xi'an-y, very anti-alien threads and Xi'an hot stirring. But I think you can actually draw those types of conclusions from the breadcrumbs that get dropped, and that's the beauty of Star Citizen law. There's so many breadcrumbs out there that CIG basically said, yeah, we've got the law set in stone here, but you've got to go find the actual truth. Here are the breadcrumbs. Here are the possibilities you've got. When you go out there in the verse, you can find those other bits and pieces that are going to draw those links and join the dots. And that's what makes, certainly from my perspective, the lore of Star Citizen so deep and so juicy and so great. I don't know whether Paul and Jale find that, but that for me is the joy.
It's how historians do their work. We look at the pieces of the puzzle and try to put them together, and often it's incomplete, but that's the fun. we like doing that. So I like it, but I also understand why some people are frustrated by it, because it's like some people just give me the wiki. I just need the wiki so I know what happened, you know? Yep. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, Jale and Al, for joining us. And we will be kind of moving right along to, I'm trying to blank on this, to the next episode, which will be probably part 2 of our Xi'an Cold War episode. Make sure that you're following both these wonderful folks on their social medias. And make sure you're subscribed to us on YouTube if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to this on our podcast, make sure to subscribe to us on all of the podcasts. I think we're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, I think we're on Google Podcasts. So wherever you're listening to this, please do stick around. We'll be back next month. Okay.